So apologies if there's any background noise. There's like someone cutting the grass, but it's like public grass, so I'm not going to moan too much. But in this segment, we're going to be talking about the Brexit mentality and Russian aggression. So we have one of our favourite commentators of the day, Daniel Hannan, a man who blocked me on Twitter for very petty reasons. And this article is quite messy. There is some truth in it to an extent, but, you know, Mr. Hannan forgets about the refugee crises that start as a byproduct of war, and doesn't really acknowledge it. He also talks about how the UK have been fast to deploy things like sanctions and other things, despite him being debunked essentially by our Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who had to admit, well, we're not really actually doing that great in regards to sanctioning. We were very late to sanction people like Roman Abramovich and I think it's Alisher Usmanov that we sanctioned as well. It took us many days to do that, to the point where Abramovich might have been able to sell Chelsea and his London home before we even did anything. But I digress. Anyways, we'll go through this mess together as we always do. So no country did more to strengthen Ukraine's defences than Britain. Again, it's hard to verify that. The Americans could have done more. I don't know. If the resistance on those Chile steps was stiffer than Vladimir Putin expected, it's partly because we spent years helping to train 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers, which is true, but the Americans have also given the Ukrainian state-of-the-art tech with Javelin missiles, which I don't think the UK makes. We make a different kind of anti-tank weapon. Those Russian tanks, whose carcasses now line the road in grisly columns, many of them were disabled by 2,000 anti-tank missiles we provided, which again is great, but you can't really take a pure victory lap on this, considering that the Americans did also play a key role in this. True, neither the UK nor any other Western allies directly engaging Russian forces, which is good considering the threat of nuclear warfare. But that decision was taken in 2008 when NATO placed Ukraine's membership application at the back of the cupboard next to Georgia's. But to be fair, if Ukraine was a NATO member, I don't think this would be happening. I don't think Russia would have invaded Ukraine. That's my opinion anyways. But for what it's worth, Britain was at the time one of Ukraine's strongest advocates, but other members felt the priority had to be the credibility of Article 5, which is if one member state is attacked, we're all attacked. And so I guess it seems like NATO members didn't want to go to bat for Ukraine just in case, because of Article 5. If you don't protect Article 5, then the whole idea of NATO kind of falls apart. So he goes on, a punitive revanchism, again using stupid words, intensified, culminating in the seizure of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. We stepped up our support diplomatically, economically and militarily. Yeah, that's why we did next to nothing about Russian oligarchs in the City of London since 2014. It's only now we've tried to do stuff, even though we're very late and some of the liquid assets would have been gone by now. But, we did such a great job since 2014, didn't we, Daniel? Even though, the UK is known as the laundromat of Russian money. Great stuff, Daniel. We sent body armour and defensive equipment, which again is great. We deployed troops, including Challenger 2 tanks, to Poland and Estonia. Well, hopefully they'll never see any action in those countries. We worked with Ukraine and Georgia to anticipate and expose Russian cyber attacks, which, okay. We changed the law to make it harder for Putin's cronies to launder money through London, which isn't actually true. Hence why they keep doing it. You can change the laws to make it harder by changing the levels from a 3 to a 4, but if they're lower than other EU countries, there's no point. The UK is the laundromat of Russian money. We might have made it slightly more difficult, in your opinion, but we know that's not the case, so that's a stupid point. By some accounts, before the invasion of Ukraine, we had already sanctioned 275 Russian individuals and entities. That's probably because we're the laundromat for the Russians. So that would make sense. We would have sanctioned them beforehand because they would have been linked to crimes, but we did very little to stop some of the top Russian oligarchs, Daniel. So none of this would need saying were it not for the bizarre narrative pushed by embittered Europhiles that Britain has somehow lagged behind the EU's response. So let's go to our embittered Europhile Liz Truss, who was a Remainer but is now an arch Brexiteer who is very much willing to wave the banner for the cause. So I might cover this in a separate video. The UK's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss admitted on Monday that Britain had been slower than the EU and US to impose sanctions on Russian oligarchs with links to Vladimir Putin, blaming the House of Lords, which genuinely it doesn't make sense. We'll talk about that in a bit more. Saying they made the legislation more onerous. The UK is trying to pass a new bill, was trying to with regards to Russian money, but again, it's already too late because they're going to take the assets out of here, whichever ones they can move. So Daniel Hannan has been debunked by another, a now Brexiteer, Liz Truss. So Liz Truss suggested to MPs that the translation of EU sanctions law into the UK's Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2018 was seized on by peers as a way to introduce a higher evidence threshold for imposing sanctions on individuals and entities. Now, I don't know which specific laws were involved here, but let's not forget there is a certain Russian gentleman who has links to the Kremlin, or alleged links to the Kremlin, in the House of Lords. So, did he have a hand in this? I don't know. But I'm not surprised some members of the House of Lords would be quite agitated to deal with things like money laundering, considering some of these people, these lords and whatever they call female lords, baroness, are maybe involved in it or may have some sort of connection to these things. A number of amendments introduced in the House of Lords made it harder to get sanctions agreed and made it cumbersome and slower, Truss told the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee. One of the other issues that we don't actually have the bandwidth in terms of the legal expertise compared to the EU to deal with these sanctions as well. The EU has a bigger access to more lawyers and more people with expertise compared to the UK. The Foreign Secretary accused crossbench peers such as Lord David Pannick and Lord Igor Judge of making it more difficult to impose sanctions. So she mentioned two of them. She said, "We had a group of lawyers and peers in the House of Lords who pushed for more cumbersome amendments that really put a very high bar on our lawyers." Now, I don't know if that's down to any alleged connections these two gentlemen may have to anyone who lives abroad. I'm not going to, go for those sorts of assertions, but they made these laws more cumbersome, according to Liz. Asked if the EU had been more nimble to date on sanctions than the EU, Truss said, "What I am saying is that the legislation in the EU, Canada and the US is less onerous than our own legislation. So Daniel Hannan's point about the sanctions and all this stuff has been debunked by Liz Truss, and these laws were set out by us in 2018. We could have made them as stringent as we can, as onerous as we wanted to, but there is still a minimum standard when it comes to these things, as we were still a member of the EU, but we've had enough time to change these things if we had wanted to, but we didn't. Once this was done, it was done." MPs are pressing ministers to go further. David Davies and Mitchell, two former Tory cabinet ministers, proposed an amendment to a bill on Monday. So this was the recent bill they tried to pass that would allow the government to freeze the assets of anyone under investigation pending a decision on whether they will be placed under sanctions, which isn't a bad idea, but it could be used wrongly. If you're just trying to be spiteful and go after people, you can just freeze their assets. And then just wait for a while if you are thinking of putting sanctions on them. That's the only danger I feel with this kind of legislation. But in this case it wouldn't be the worst thing if they have links to the Kremlin. So, the bill itself isn't great. The bill in question gives individuals a 6-month grace period before they will be included on the register. Ministers had originally proposed it to be 18 months. Now it's going to be 6 months, which is very easy for Russians to get their money out of the UK, or anyone with criminal connections, really. So again, it's a joke from this dude. He just he's been debunked by Liz Truss. Fair enough, this article came out a few days after, about 5 days after Lord Hannan had written his piece, but it just goes to show you how much joke this man is. He talked about his time in America, where some Republicans are so eaten up with the dislike of President Biden that they seem almost to want Ukraine to fall, as to say, "I told you so." Isn't it ironic that such a staunch Brexiteer is spending time in the US rather than in the now sovereign UK? Strange, Daniel. We have our equivalents in this country. From the moment Russian armour crossed the border, incounselable Remainers declared that Britain, by leaving the EU, had lost all influence. When, I don't know anyone who said that, but anyone who did say that is probably one of those FBPE people. There's proper aggressive ones who make no sense half the time, and was rowing in pathetically behind the sanctions regime determined in Brussels, which is far more effective than ours, especially because there is a lot of Russian money in the UK, and the UK don't have the bandwidth to deal with it. And if we were still members of the EU would no doubt have helped us in this regard, so we could sanction Russian money and stop that money coming out of the UK, and therefore put more pressure on Vladimir Putin, because even the Foreign Secretary admitted the UK has been slower on Russian sanctions. Dude. Here to pluck an example at random is the former Minister Nick Boles, who resigned over Brexit, saying, "What do my Brexiteer friends and former colleagues think of the fact that the EU has proven itself far more muscular and effective than the UK, led by Boris Johnson?" Which is true. It says, across the board, delivering weapons, increasing defence budgets, and enforcing sanctions. And EU sanctions in certain contexts would be far better than UK ones, because they have access to more weapons, such as SWIFT, which the EU kicked Russia out of. The UK couldn't have done that, because each of these complaints are demonstrably false. When it comes to sanctions, they're demonstrably true. While Britain was sending missiles, Germany was blocking the transfer of military equipment across its border by other NATO allies, because Germany has a policy of not transferring weapons to war zones. It doesn't allow it to go through transit, but there are other ways of going to Ukraine rather than through Germany. While Britain was pushing for across-the-board sanctions, EU states were carving out their special interests: luxury handbags for Italy, diamonds for Belgium, because the EU is far more dependent on trade from Russia, because they are closer to Russia. Which again, this is one of those things where it's not the EU, it's not the EU at fault for this. It's individual member states, and it does go to show you that member states do have power when Brexiteers were always saying they don't have any. The total value of Russian bank assets sanctioned from the UK is 258 billion, in the EU's 38.8 billion. The key point is that, there's more Russian money in the UK then, evidently. Mate, it's not a hard one to figure out. If the UK is the laundromat of Russian money, where do you think most of the Russian money is going to be? In the UK. Daniel, come on, bro. He says, "I don't say this to criticise our European allies." Just a bit of a strange thing to do, but okay. He goes, "The problem isn't the EU governments, it's with the large minority of British commentators who are so blinded by their dislike of Brexit and their loathing of Boris Johnson, they cannot bring themselves to acknowledge Britain has done anything right," which is not true. Apart from some really rampant FBPE people and probably a few other stupid people, the UK has done good things in this regard. We have given defensive weapons to Ukraine, and we have played our part in that regard. But when it comes to doing other things like helping refugees, we have done no such thing, to the point where Poland is feeling the strain of Ukraine's refugees. We're going to talk about that in a separate video, especially in the context of global refugee crises, where countries are expected, the countries in the immediate vicinity are expected to take the vast amount of refugees with very little help from other countries. We're going to be talking about that in a separate video. But a simple point is, Daniel, we haven't done our regards. We haven't helped out when it comes to refugees. We've barely done anything, especially compared to EU member states. It's just a stupid point. So evidently we haven't done everything, and there are criticisms for the British government when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But, our boy Daniel does not mention any of these things in this piece. Why is that, Daniel? Why is it that you haven't criticised the UK in any regard? You criticise these rampant Remainers for their, ultra-aggressive takes on British policies. The fact that they don't give any praise to the UK, which, when it comes to arming, giving defensive weapons and helping out the Ukrainian military, we have helped out, we have done our bit. When it comes to other aspects, we haven't. Why is it, Daniel, that I can offer nuance and you can't? It's not hard, Daniel. If I can do it, most certainly a member of the House of Lords should be able to as well, considering you got a double first from Oxford. Surely you should be able to do this, Daniel. That's why he blocked me on Twitter, by the way, because I made a joke and he did not like it. Very thin-skinned. Some of the criticism, though, is so deranged that it harms both our democratic legitimacy at home and our reputation overseas. He says, take, for example, the charge that the Conservatives are somehow corrupted by Russian money. If the Kremlin really did try to buy the Tories, it was the worst investment in history. Well, it's not been that bad considering we've been very slow on sanctions, but given that the Kremlin's goal wasn't to buy out the British government so they don't do anything, the Kremlin's goal typically is destabilisation, hence why they would back a candidate like Trump, hence why they would go through for a policy like Brexit, because this would destabilise the West, and they were successful in that. America under Trump was very much confused and very pathetic when it came to foreign policy. As the crisis loomed, the PM wove a cat's cradle, which, what the hell does that even mean, around the global rallying support. As Russian troops wheeled and drilled on the border, he dashed from Krakow to Kiev, from New York to Brussels. And the simple fact is, yeah, he ran around, trying to be Churchill and all these things, rallying everyone, when he didn't do the basic things at home, like sanctioning oligarchs, especially the ones that have links to the Kremlin. He didn't do that. Yeah, he got to jet off and go on holiday to these other places and talk to people and do the whole Churchill stick, but didn't do the hard yards at home, which, credit to Churchill, he actually did. In Munich, days before the invasion, he warned of what was about to happen. He said, "I believe that in preparing to invade Ukraine, a proud country's armed forces now exceed 200,000 personnel, considerably more expert in combat today than in 2014, because there has been a civil war in Ukraine. Putin and his circle are gravely miscalculating." I mean, that doesn't mention anything. Well, he does say, "I believe that in preparing to invade Ukraine, the Russians are, not out of their depth, but they're underestimating the Ukrainians." But again, he didn't really. Well, he has kind of said that there will be a Ukrainian invasion, so you got to give him some credit there. Few public figures were so vindicated. Most commentators, including, I'm embarrassed to admit this one could not quite believe that Putin would launch an all-out invasion. And to be fair, most people didn't. I don't think even the Americans thought this was going to happen, an all-out invasion. EU governments and Ukrainian politicians dismissed the warnings because it wouldn't make sense for Vlad to do this. It didn't make sense, and it still doesn't make sense now. Even the US, which shared Britain's analysis of what could, not what would happen, is what could have happened, has a patchy record, which the US intelligence do have. Britain, by contrast, calibrated its response carefully. Ah, yes. So very carefully. Yes. They were very careful. We were very careful. Not that this soothed the armchair critics for a week now. Aren't you one of those armchair critics though, pal? Really? For a week now, British defeatists have been gleefully circulating a clip of the Prime Minister's appearance before the Defence Select Committee, in which, responding to Tobias Ellwood, argued that technological advances have made it unlikely that we will need to deploy large numbers of British tanks on the continent, essentially saying tank warfare is over. He goes, look at Ukraine, what are those columns then, eh? Crow the naysayers, almost willing the Russians to prove Johnson wrong. I mean, no, they weren't. They were just saying Johnson was wrong. They didn't want Johnson to be wrong. No sane person in Europe or the world wants to see tank warfare again. So again, this whole thing doesn't make any sense. But in the event, tanks did improve to be of limited use against missiles and drones. That's one of the reasons why tanks wouldn't be used so much. But the thing is, right, these Russian tanks are so outdated. Russian equipment is so outdated, it makes them easy targets for things like drones and missiles. But again, Johnson was wrong about tank warfare being over in Europe. It did happen. To the annoyance of cynics, global Britain has risen to its second challenge, the first being the vaccine rollout. And again, the only reason the vaccine rollout was so initially successful was the simple fact that we were importing vaccines from other countries and not exporting them. And if you look at the UK's vaccine rollout, which I'm a bit CBA to do right now because we've gone through it so many times, our vaccine rollout is actually slower percentage-wise than other EU member states. So yes, our initial rollout was good, but the problem was we did it at the expense of other countries, which we should never have done. Vaccines should have been about need rather than, we've got loads, we're just going to give them out to, sort of middle-aged people who don't need them as much as elderly people in other countries. Instead of hiding behind a common European front, we built a worldwide coalition against the aggressor, and yet whilst we were doing so, we forgot to tie up things at home. Again, I don't know how many times I have to cite this example for Lord Hannan. As we were not alone, of course. We worked with with allies in the G7. Allies in the G7, which are, some of those are EU members. The Commonwealth, who didn't really do a lot. And yes, the EU. But we showed leadership. We were willing to back our words with deeds, apart from when it came to sanctions, evidently. Again, bro, stop making me cite this other article. Back in October, I started to hear hints from Ukrainian politicians that the Americans were concentrating on Taiwan and leaving it to Britain to defend Europe. I mean, that's been US foreign policy, I believe, since the end of the Cold War, to focus on I don't know which part of the ocean is called, but kind of China and China's influence on the world rather than on Europe. That's been pretty much US policy since the Cold War and potentially since 1945. There was, the US did invade or did attack China, I believe. At one point, the US got kicked out brutally, and then they focused on NAM. So the US has been focusing on, I think it's Southeast Asia, as it would be called, for a long time. I wondered whether they could really have been told this, and if they had, whether we would do our part. In the event, yes, patchily and imperfectly. But it's interesting that Daniel Hannan does not mention the imperfect parts. I have. I've offered nuance where I could. It's not going to be the best analysis because I don't offer the best analysis. I do my best. Evidently, Daniel Hannan does not, because he didn't mention the fact that we're failing when it comes to sanctions. We're failing when it comes to helping refugees. But we're giving things like anti-tank missiles, which is good. I'm not denying that. It's good. How much are we giving in terms of other resources, though, to the Ukrainian military? I don't know. Food and other things which militaries need. He goes, so today Britain is offering a model of responsible leadership. No, it's not. What Britain is offering is, all you guys need to do more, but we're not going to do our bit. That's what UK is offering in terms of leadership. Always has done. Net zero over here, but we're going to import more food from countries that have lower standards than us, that are further away, so that they increase their carbon output and we reduce ours. We're not a model for responsible leadership. Yeah, we'll take Russian money. Who cares? We'll make our country the laundromat of dirty money. Who cares? Combining sanctions, which we've done a poor job of, intelligence, which we've done an okay job of, cybersecurity, which I can't really comment on too much because I don't know much about it, and proportionate force, which, okay, we've given a lot of defensive weapons, but and probably offensive weapons, to be honest, but not much more than that. Fine, we've done almost as much as other kind of NATO members, except the sanctions. This thing. And also, the ones that have done the most damage are the EU, because Putin didn't anticipate that he'd be kicked out of SWIFT, and he was swiftly kicked out of the money messaging system. Ukrainians appreciate it, even if our domestic commentators do not. And again, apart from one person you cited, I don't know who else you're talking about. It's a complete straw man. Even if we may be sure Europe is watching our example, sure, if Europe are watching our example, they would have kept SWIFT up and barely done any sanctions and moaned at other people for not doing enough. That's what would have happened, pal. Especially since our bill's so weak that, Russian oligarchs have really about 6 months to get their money out of the UK if they really want to. They don't have to, shell companies don't have to declare who actually has the money until about 6 months in. So it's a joke, to be honest. This man's a comedian. But anyways, look, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.